We're going to do this a little bit different. When we started putting this conference together, it very quickly became evident that something was different this year compared to last year. Last year, it was like 10 times the number of people signing up rapidly. A number of the presentations that we had were actually over capacity. And with a 24-hour clock running for 3 days, the conference was virtually totally filled. There was only like just 3 to 4 empty time slots. Everything else was filled in. The issue of being an American European event was totally out the window. To fill in all the time slots, it became a European Asian community, an Asian American community, and an American European, and that it was totally planned out. Everything was involved. And as I said, a number of the discussions actually hit capacity with Zoom meetings, and people were being turned away because there was too many people in the room already. This year, something was different. And I'm not sure I could put my finger on it other than the world has gone through another year of Zoom and COVID lockdowns. And I'm thinking that people just got tired and burned out and were no longer interested in doing more. And when I was thinking about that, I said, well, let's add one more. Let's make this maybe a little bit more lighthearted and talk about some of our experiences and the stories we can tell. And some of them that I've got here that I could talk about are dramatic, extreme failures. But at the same time, in many cases, you can see the failure coming. At least some people could see it coming. Others that were leading it obviously did not. But we can also learn a lot about change by what others do wrong. So I'm going to kick it off with a story, and then I'll turn it over to others. And like I said, I've got a couple stories I can tell if you run out of stories. But the one I'm going to talk about first was under the banner of one company, one team. Okay. This was in a very large organization that was highly siloed, a lot of infighting. And an example was that 2 vice presidents would each handle different product lines, but they would jointly host a meeting of multiple product lines. So they were there at the same customer meeting. Some of the sessions were joint for both product lines, but others were really separate. But these people, these leaders, did not get along at all. And an example came really to the forefront, and that we were generally at a resort for these conferences, and we would have an evening heavy buffet and drinks around the pool. So one day we were standing around the pool, I was chatting up with some people I work with. And a lot of times when you get together with something like this, you'll be talking with customers, but you'll also be talking with people that you don't really meet that often, sharing notes, cross-organization issues. And one vice president, the vice president that I reported to, actually came over, rather unexpected, seemed to be in a jovial mood, put his hand over a couple of our shoulders and whispered. He says, some of you think that, Bob and I don't like each other. That's really not true. I hate the son of a bitch. And with that, he walked away. But that was pretty emblematic of the type of relationship that they had at the executive level. And that pretty much flowed down throughout the rest of the organization. Now, with that as a backdrop, the CEO decided he wanted to address the silos that were so obvious. So he created a team that was led by the vice president of human resources to lead the team. And it was labeled one company, one team, addressing the silo issue head on. And at that time, I was working on my doctorate degree and was obviously deep involved with my studies. And I was outside of this effort, but I was hearing about it. And part of what I was hearing about was their use of John Cotter's Leading Change book. It was a fairly new book at that time. And the company had bought a couple cases of this book and was handing them out throughout the company. And I said, oh, that's pretty cool, because I just read the book and had used it as a deep dive into some of my doctoral research work. So I said, oh, okay, I've got something I could offer to this team. So I sent an email to the vice president of HR, and I knew him, didn't know him really well, but we knew each other by name. So I sent an email to him telling him that I was working on my doctorate in leadership and organizational change and had just been deeply involved with some study on Cotter's book and offered my assistance to help with the culture change. The email that he replied back took me by surprise. He was very polite in thanking me for my offer, but, quote, they did not need help with culture change until the 8th step. I said, what? No. Okay. I read the book and he says, the whole book is culture change. And he's saying that we don't need help with culture change until the 8th step. And I couldn't figure out how he got that idea. So that night when I went home, I pulled the book out and I spent some time looking at it. And Exhibit 2 on page 21 has the list of the 8 steps. Step 8 is, quote, anchoring new approaches in the culture, end quote. That is the only place on that entire page where the word culture is used. It didn't occur to me that he was running this entire change initiative off of one page in the book. And he thanked me for my assistance because culture wasn't involved until the 8th stage. Now, to put this into a little bit more, Cotter spends a lot of time talking about the guiding coalition and how critical it is to get the right people on a guiding coalition. Well, as you might expect, getting the right people on the guiding coalition is not easy and oftentimes very political. So this effort, led by this HR vice president, decided to take the easy route to the guiding coalition and placed all vice presidents and all general managers on the guiding coalition, about 50 people at that time. As you might expect, that killed it, because the key people that were basically creating the silos were now at the VP level sitting on this guiding coalition with all their general managers on the same guiding coalition. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting, because they put so much pressure behind this as being so important that this effort went on for about 2 years of corporate communications putting out all these glowing reports and the changes and everything that they're tasked to do. And the guiding coalitions basically kept fighting among themselves, nothing happening. And you begin to wonder, how do you end such a debacle? Well, the vice president of HR actually got very creative. He sent out a letter to all employees thanking them for all their great efforts over the previous 2 years to help be so successful in the one company, one team change initiative. That after all that hard work, we now need to take a little bit of a break. And sometime in the next year, we'll take a look to see where we need to go with the next step of one company, one team. So he basically declared success and moved on. I use that as a great example of different ways that you can deal with projects. And one way is basically declare success and move on and don't look back. Okay, that's my first story. Any questions, comments on that story from others?
No, I don't have any comments, but thanks for sharing. It made me laugh.
It still makes me laugh to this day. But again,
Amen.
I mean, he's leading the effort from one page in a book. And he's the head of HR.
Yeah. I can totally relate to that. It's interesting that in the moment, it can be very frustrating to see someone who doesn't get it, having so much power on a project. But then when we look back, we're like, oh, I mean, it's ridiculous. Anyway, so we can laugh at it. But yeah, I think I've had experience like this where it's like, it's so obvious, right? It's so, I don't know. It's like you try to relay a message, but there are some of them, the leaders or those who are deciding for those projects, they live on a different planet somehow. I don't know. I don't wish to be in the world sometimes because it looks like a bit crazy, but it seems so simple. They could just stop and listen and get clarity on how to approach things, but they keep hammering the same old idea they had. For some reason, they might have promised it to someone else. I don't know.
I mean, how many mistakes can you make, and how many obvious mistakes can you make that others see so clearly? I've got a couple other stories, but did anyone else want to jump in with a story they'd like to share before I jump in with the second story?
Just a comment on that one, Ross. The guy who eloquently stopped phase one, did he become a politician?
Say again?
Did he become a politician?
No, he actually retired in place as the head of HR.
Because it's a classic politician response, isn't it?
Yeah. And when you think about this, okay, this was really at the height of the strategic HR movement too. In that he was in a perfect place to really make a major impact on the organization. And he completely threw away the opportunity and probably made it worse, given the amount of man hours that went into this effort to do absolutely nothing.
So, Dr. Ross, nobody was held accountable. There were no accountability factors at all,
none.
That they needed to deliver? None?
Oh, none at all. The CEO was still in place. He had basically turned it over to the head of HR, and other than a few corporate communication messages that he put his name to that were written by the corporate communications department, I can't think of any involvement he really had. There was really there weren't even any large all hands on deck meetings. Everything was handled through email or communication through the corporate newsletters or downward through the hierarchy. Like I said, the head of HR, he basically saved face by declaring success and thanking everyone for their hard work. And everyone was so glad to be done with it that nobody wanted to keep it going. They were happy to let it die at that point.
It reminds me of the days of re-engineering. Remember when we were in the re-engineering days? I'm old enough to remember that. And everybody was trying to be re-engineered, but a lot of us didn't know what we were being re-engineered for or why or to.
Yeah. Well, I've got another story that comes out of re-engineering too. But before I go that, let me offer opportunity to anyone else if they want to tell a story.
I can give you one about me.
Okay.
And someone trying to develop me. So they were trying to change me. Okay.
Okay.
And I was pretty young, and I had Carl Rogers as a tutor. So you can't get much better than that for the beginning of a world in OB. And I'd also gone through a lot with the Tavistock Centre, Eric Trist, and people like this. So the pedigree of the people who were trying to help me couldn't be any better. And then came the great day when I was asked to help part of the British police become aware of how to do strategic planning as part of the new public management approach that became vogue at that time. And these people were about 150 of them in this big hall, and they were senior politicians, senior police officers, and senior members of the armed services. As I say, about 150. And there's me, this young guy, who was given the task of, first of all, explaining what new public management was, because even then, none of them had done any real strategic planning whatsoever in their careers. And they weren't really looking forward to doing it now. And so the Tavistock said, look, one of your trainer mentors will come with you and support you. So I thought, well, that's really nice. That's really helpful. But I was a little bit nervous. And one of the things that Carl Rogers and the Tavistock sort of encourage you to do is use open questions. Don't have solutions. Ask questions, get the audience or the client to find their own answers to and solutions to their own problems. And so this was hammered into me. And so I was up on a stage with all these people around me. And it was going quite well, I thought. And then I asked a question. And this voice from behind all these dignitaries screamed at me, Reg, if you know the answer, why the effing hell have you asked the question? And I thought, God, and I sort of shrunk. I became tiny. I wanted to vanish. I wanted to die in front of all these people. He was basically accusing me of heresy, really, heresy. And of course, I sort of got my way through it by bluffing it and so on. And so when we broke for lunch a little bit later on, I went over to him and I said, what the hell was all that about? I said, you've embarrassed me, you made me look stupid, blah, 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 blah. And he said, well, what's one of the key things about knowing about yourself and developing yourself? So I said, well, you have to make sense of yourself, go through experiences. He said, well, I guess you went through one of those experiences this morning. How do you feel about that? And off he went, how do you feel? What was the effect of that? And this was his very, very strong, powerful approach to developing me. This Freudian concept that in order to understand love, you've got to go through hate. and I learned so much from that, and I thought I would never do that to anybody. Yeah, so that was about changing me, and it certainly did.
Any comments from others?
No, but thanks for sharing, Reg.
Yes,
Okay.
Thank you. Funny. But I'm sure it wasn't funny at the time.
It certainly wasn't. It was actually quite painful. But when I look back, he was actually right. I maybe didn't like the delivery and the timing of it with all these people. But his message was right. And if we do know the answer, then why ask the question? And so there were two things for me there. One was, don't ask the question if you know the answer. But the second was, don't look for the answer. Just ask the question. And that second part for me was a very, very important learning in working with clients in a client-centered way. I don't even know what their problem is. I don't want to know what their problem is. I want to help them make sense of what it is and how they come to their solutions. And so that was part of his very tough love approach to my development.
Let me give another story then. This actually comes out of the quality movement. It wasn't necessarily business process re-engineering, but it was very closely related. The manufacturing units were heavily involved with doing a number of quality programs, and we're getting good results. And someone, and I'm not sure exactly where this change initiative initiated, But somehow the idea was planted that what's done on manufacturing for quality improvement could be done across the organization for all management functions. I mean, all management functions. So they put together a project initiative called Integrated Management System. The concept was to do a quality program for all management functions and how all those management functions could be integrated together. It was basically a search for best practices with plans to codify those best practices for implementation across the organization, such that if a good management practice was found one area of the company, that then would be shared across the company and would become an accepted, standardized best practice for that management area. Now, if anybody knows anything about complexity science and management in general, this had failure written all over it of the number of exceptions that you're going to run into. But somehow they got to the president of the company, and the president not only put this into the strategic plan, but actually funded it with different departments across the organization that was tasked with identifying, codifying, and diffusing this great knowledge of management practices. So the first step of this was every manager in the company, from supervisor up to the vice president level, had to take a training course. It was a week-long in-person training course on how all these forms were to be filled out about what you do as a manager, what the different practices are, and it was very elaborate. I mean, it was extensive spreadsheets that everybody had to fill out, and multiple ways of looking at all the things that you do every day. And the key was that you had to go to this, but most important, in that when you finished this course, you were awarded a golf shirt, a very nice golf shirt with a logo, not only the company, but for this change initiative for the integrated management system. So it almost became a culture that, because we were with an informal dress code, these golf shirts were the norm. And if you were seen walking around with an integrated management system golf shirt, you were seen as, okay, you're on board, you're with the program, and you're now accepted as completing, and everything is good with the change initiative. Well, a few months after all the training was done, people were happily wearing their shirts. These different change teams came to the realization that nothing was happening. So they started putting pressure on all the managers to start to fill out these forms. And I figured, okay, this is kind of strange, because I didn't know where to begin. I mean, there's so many things to do. And at this time I was doing special projects. Special projects within this company was basically a mix of internal consulting and whatever did not fit anywhere else. If something needed to be done, I did it. For example, one of the projects I did was I got the corporate internet off the ground. I did that in 6 months with an intern from a local college. After we got it off the ground, I turned it over to IT and a task force of 6 people. But again, that was typical, that I was always doing something different. So I didn't know where to begin on this. But everything was on the corporate intranet. So I said, okay, let me go see what others are doing. So I started pulling up different worksheets that managers across the company were filling out. And it was kind of interesting. I saw a pattern. Almost every single one had filled out the top level information, who's doing it, the dates, what their department is. And underneath there was a basic skeleton of some of the things that they did. So when you look at the form, you could see that this department had filled out the form by the manager of that department. And there's a first start of some of the basic information, but none of the real hard work. There was no detail involved. And there was a number of statements of, to be filled out after more analysis, or to be completed after more study. It was basically a start with a promise to do more. So, okay, if everyone's doing that, I'll do that. I basically did mine the same way. I filled out the basic. And once you fill out the basics, that basically got you from under the fire, because you're now seen as doing something out there, though you really haven't done much of anything. And you're no longer a target to do your forms to get it filled out. So that was kind of interesting, and that basically I got from under the fire, but so did everybody else, but nothing was really being done. Okay. Now, this is about a year later then, and a new president had come in, which would have been a perfect time to have killed the project. But he came in from outside, did not know anything about it, and all he saw was integrated management systems. Oh, that sounds pretty good. I guess I'll keep that project going. So because he didn't know enough to kill it, he basically let it go, and I got budgeted for another year. This project ran on that way for 3 years of being budgeted. People at all locations basically, I don't know what they were doing. They were basically looking at a database of not much there, trying to advocate. I mean, they did a number of, really fancy, pretty brochures about how great this system is, and rah, rah, this and that, but nothing was done. And after the 3rd year, it was just quietly gone. Okay, the people that were employed in this over probably the previous 6 months had slowly been deployed elsewhere in the organizations as openings became available. So by the time it hit the end of its 3rd year of life and the budget ran out, there's really nobody that was still doing anything at all for the formal project. So unlike the earlier story where the head of it declared success and thanked everybody, this one just kind of whimpered away. The people that were involved were slowly absorbed elsewhere, and nobody spoke of it again. And as it went on, the thrill of being able to show that you're on board wearing the shirt went away, and you never saw the shirts again. So kind of a completely different approach available. Okay. Comments on that?
As you can see, I'm still laughing. You have a good way of telling story. Yeah, no, it's so interesting. It just reminded me of an organization that I knew was set up by a small group of people in the department where I work with. It was like this project management office with all the tools and the dashboards and the processes and everything. And eventually, after 2 or 3 years of setting it up, and I think they were, starting to have all the project managers across the department to adhere to it. And they also had the ACP system and the module for projects. The lead of that group retired. A few months later, is second, I guess, in command, or, responsible for this, moved on, and everything fell apart. Nothing else happened. It's like everybody, all the project manager, I was one of the project manager who helped, setting up, contributed to them, providing feedback, etc. And eventually it was like, okay, we don't have to fill those forms anymore and report on those dashboards. Nobody's reading them.
Yeah. So, in this case, nobody wanted to kill it, but who wants to kill something that sounds so good? But when you look at what it is, there's nothing there because it's kind of like a shell that you could never fill out. Okay. Other comments?
Yeah, no, I think all of us have been part of programs that come in as, the program of the year, and it'll go on for a year, 2 years. And then eventually there's not enough support, either the leadership changes or, we went through that in organizations where I've been before, developing and leading effective organizations, and brought in consultants and had internal people. I was one of them. Mm-hmm. And we couldn't pick up enough momentum to keep it going. Was it a cultural change? I think for some people, but overall the organization didn't support it. And then certainly changes financially and with the market and leadership, it just came to a halt. And it's really sad because I think some of those programs have a lot of potential if they're implemented and supported properly, and if you get the right people behind them. But in most cases, it just doesn't have sustainability. It just doesn't seem to permeate the organization where there's enough momentum.
Yep. Now I've got another one that's somewhat similar, and this one goes back way, way, way back. And this was when I had just gotten out of school. I was probably out of college maybe 1 year, and was working in the systems department doing accounting systems. And this was a corporate-wide initiative. And I'm not sure how much the company spent on this, but this was a brainstorm of some outside consultant that the executives thought was a really great idea. But again, it was so easy to game the system. And let me explain. The theme of this change was called Have a Bad Day, B-A-D, day. Okay. And the whole idea was built around bad, and that was $1 a day. Buck is $1 a day. So the whole idea then is that if every employee found a way to save the company $1 a day, that would be millions of dollars bottom line for the company. So they put together this whole initiative with all of the meetings and the fanfare and everything called $1 a day, have a bad day. And it was basically an employee suggestion system. And you had to fill out a form of your money saving idea. And you filled out the forms. It went to a committee that would review them. And if accepted, you were then awarded a bad coffee cup. It was a coffee mug with, I had a bad day on it. And it very quickly became a cultural need. And that if you were to be seen on board and be a good company employee, you were going to the coffee with your bad mug. So everybody was struggling to come up with ideas. And it turns out you didn't really need to have a good idea. You just needed to have an idea, because the group that was running this, they were basically not being judged on the quality nor the implementation of the ideas. They were being judged based upon the number of ideas received. So if they received an idea or suggestion for improvement, they jumped on it right away, gave the coffee mug, because that gave them one more tally mark of showing success for them. So, not knowing much at all, I was new to the company. I submitted an idea of consolidating office supplies so that it wasn't an office supply cabinet in every department, but a centralized one for the complex of offices. And I justified it by giving some estimate of the number of dollar amount sitting in that supply cabinet. Now, that was a bad idea. I know it was a bad idea. But again, it was an idea. In reality, it wasn't valued as the supply value, but the cost of capital in that supply cabinet, okay, which was a minuscule component of the amount that I attributed to that supply cabinet. But the people that were accepting the suggestions didn't care about that. Also, to the extent that somebody needed a pencil or a pad of paper and they did not have one, now instead of walking across and down the hall, they had to go down to the basement of the building or to the building next door to get that same pencil or pad of paper. Any time to do that acquisition of the office supply dramatically erased anything that I had in my suggestion. But I was happy to support the initiative, and I happily got my coffee with my bad coffee mug. It's being seen as a loyal employee. Basically, once everybody got their bad coffee mugs, the whole idea basically disappeared, went away. They satisfied, they got rid of all the mugs. There were no more mugs left. And there's no need to show off your mug anymore because the program is over and nobody saw the mugs again. End of story. That's one that kind of went away. But who'd even think about $1 a day with the coffee mug? I don't know, but this company spent a lot of time and money doing it. Comments?
Never ceases to amaze me that when they bring in these crazy ideas, they never look at the cost of running them and where the break-even point is on these wonderful ideas that never materialize.
Yeah. And in this case, they had no desire whatsoever to implement them. They had no desire to even think about how good that they were. All they needed to do is process the paperwork, hand out the mug, and they were satisfied at that point. And it did show some things, though, of how some people will, with peer support, jump on board, even if it is superficial support.
But in some cases, those initiatives build some synergy or energy within departments or within, they may not have been wanting actually to save $1 a day just to build some employee morale. It's costly because I've been in the other end where we closed offices and there are cases of mugs or t-shirts or tote bags or whatever that at one time everybody wanted, and then the program died out and you've got to get rid of them. But I think sometimes companies do that just for synergy purposes, don't you? I mean, it's just a way to add something different to the routine of coming into work every day. I don't know that there's any ROI, but
yeah, I could see that for relationship building, camaraderie. I could see that. I mentioned earlier that we did these company meetings, and one of the things we did at the company meetings that was really well done is that we had a golf shirt, a different design, different color golf shirt for every year. And when people, including the customers, would go back years later, they would wear their shirt from previous years. So it became a real, not so much statusism, but a part of the team of not only did you get a new shirt for that meeting, but you're wearing the shirts for previous meetings. And in that case, it was really well done because the customers were distributors.
mm-hmm.
And we would run marketing programs that required their participation with their money.
Mm-hmm.
So to a large extent, we would spend money to encourage them to spend money to help joint market. And it went very well because, when you talk about what is a company, what is a brand,
mm-hmm.
those lines get really fuzzy. And
mm-hmm.
having those shirts became part of that team effort that really blended across organizational boundaries.
Yeah, it becomes like a symbolic cultural memento or whatever, it just kind of builds that camaraderie,
Mm-hmm.
I think. And especially if you're dealing with your customers or suppliers that are
Right.
also wearing it, that really builds your brand. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, because I always thought about, they talk about boundaries of an organization, but even when you get to like ecosystems, I mean, what is the boundary? What is the brand boundary? What is a partnership when you're dealing with people in supply chain? It gets really messy quick when you start thinking about, my organization versus them because it's so integrated.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to what Dolores said about these things can also have benefit within the team, the organization as a whole. I remember I was asked to review with HR their performance management system, and they were using the classic management by objectives, and they had all the classic problems of copy and paste the objectives every year. And as a system, if we believe such systems ever motivate, which is common knowledge, I don't believe they do, then what is the cost of such a system and what do we get back from it? And so we did this piece of work, and we had this meeting with the CEO, and I said, well, from what we've seen, this process is costing you X million pounds a year. And we've seen no real benefit in terms of productivity that's come out of this process. Not that there may not be, but we can't find anything really tangible that you've benefited from in your bottom line. And it was a very wise old CEO who looked at us and he said, thank you. You've reinforced my feelings about the whole process. And I think it's important that I'm honest with the organization with these findings, and also my reason for having this management by objectives process. He said that the millions of pounds that you state, for me, is a very small sum of money if I can get my managers to speak to my staff at least twice a year. And that was what he was using this MBO process for. It was nothing about performance management. It was just to get his managers to talk to his people. And that was his return on this very large investment. So it sort of links in with what you were saying, Dolores, that there are more things around what seems a simple process for something else.
Yes, absolutely. Because sometimes you need to look at what you're paying for salaries and benefits, and people aren't, there's no synergy amongst divisions or departments. And I've been part of those change efforts where department heads or VPs or whatever you call them, there's like a sibling rivalry, right? They want to meet the numbers, they want to exceed numbers. And how do you bring them together as the CEO or a regional VP? And some of these things that may seem symbolic, and in your case, that's a lot of money for 2 events to get. But long term, when you take salaries and benefits, the payoff is huge if you can get them to help you meet your goals.
The story that you just shared, Reg, it resonates a lot because there's so many projects I've been involved in. At first, when I started them, I was trying to understand the objective behind the system or the overall solution that was being proposed. And quite often, it's convoluted. It's like those big benefits and outcomes we want to achieve. And sometimes it comes down to something as simple as you said, we just want people to talk, right? But they come up with those big projects and we're going to implement this to achieve that and this and this. At the end of the day, when you talk with them and we're trying to get to the root causes of the issues they're dealing with, it's as simple as having people to talk or breaking down silos or whatever, but they come up with those big solutions thinking that's going to solve it all. And then halfway into the project, they don't get the results they want and they wonder why, because they weren't clear on the actual outcomes or the real need behind it in the first place.
Yeah, so, I had a wonderful mentor, not the one that was the awful one who called me out in front of this big audience, but Patrick was an amazing man. He was a true Irish storyteller. He started his career as a reporter on the local newspaper, so he was a very good raconteur and writer, and later went into consultancy and other things. And he was a guy who was a passionate believer in the only tool you needed was your head. All these models and theories and everything else that everybody tries to sell us today, that was all unnecessary. And as a youngster, I'd been on my MBA and I had all these wonderful visions of models and theories and goodness knows what else. And we went to this big headquarters to run a 3-day workshop. And it was very hot weather, extremely hot weather. And this thing was being on the third floor, and there was no lift. And I had a car full of boxes of questionnaires and pamphlets and all sorts of paraphernalia for all these wonderful pest analyses and Porter's 5 forces and all this nonsense. And Patrick sort of got out the car with nothing. And he wandered off to get himself a cup of tea and watched whilst I carried all these boxes on this very hot day up these 3 flights of stairs. And it took me about an hour to unload all this stuff. And then he'd suddenly appear again, feeling refreshed and calm and cool. And he'd come up to the 3rd floor where I was sitting there with sweat pouring from me, exhausted. And he looked at me and said, he said, do you have a pen, old boy? He said, I seem to have forgotten my pen. And it was his way of saying to me, you don't need all this rubbish. You only need your brain and maybe a pen. And at the end of this 3 days, he had used this pen twice. And that was purely to write down what he wanted for lunch the next day. And all the materials I brought for this wonderful workshop were all sitting on the table at the back, waiting for me to carry them all down back to the car. We'd used none of it, had achieved miracles in this workshop. And he looked at me and he said, well done, old boy. He said, I think we've done some learning over the last 3 days. What do you think? And it really brought it home to me. We tend to go for all these wonderful gizmos and magic things that people sell us or try to, but we don't actually need it. Because, as you were saying, if we just say to somebody, well, what did they say when you asked the question? Well, I haven't asked them the question. Well, what stopped you? And then when they start talking, you sit back. You don't need all these magic forms from questionnaires and things. You just need to get them to talk and listen. And so I'm a passionate believer in this. And this, as I always say, sit down with a cup of tea and just have big ears, listen, and ask the odd naive question. And in most cases, it works. And yeah, we can have a lot of success just with that cup of tea.
Any other stories you would like to throw in to the mix?
I could maybe try to share one. I don't know, it's maybe not like a crazy story like yours, but it's one where that would show that, I mean, it's like kind of a failure, but it was a success in the end, but it was almost a failure. And I'll tell you why. I was on this project, I was with the government, federal government in Canada, and I was hired as a project manager to help plan and implement this innovative project. And innovative in the way that we were partnering with a special program within the government that would allow startup companies to actually test basically or implement their new solutions, as part of a project or the government. And so we had this program that had a need for a specific software, and this startup company that qualified through that innovation program to be tested and implemented in the government. And so we said, okay, we'll build a project. So I was hired as the project was being approved to actually partner and use that organization to deliver the project. So it's all fine. It's all by the books, right? This organization is already pre-qualified for this innovation program. And I start building the project management documentations for approvals and all the gates and all those things. But what they didn't figure out within the department I was in is that their ways of approving projects and approving IT systems was still the normal, like not innovative, was just by the old book way of doing things. So it was a hurdle at each approval gate. It was very, very interesting, and up to senior management. I had to brief the top leaders, at the board for the project management board, and they would say things like, "But what's how is this company qualified? Like, what's their experience? Do they have 10 years of experience doing this? No, that's a startup. That's the purpose of partnering with this innovation program, is to give them a showcase, and so we can benefit from the innovation." It was always repeating and repeating, but they were stuck by, no, we approve companies if they have this in records, and we approve projects if we can demonstrate that. And it was like an endless paperwork process, and try to convince each of the steps of approval for project. Meanwhile, we were carrying on the project on the side, like the director responsible for that solution that needed that system for our organization. She just said, let's just keep going, keep working with this organization. Let's, design, build, and implement, and we'll go through the hurdles at the same time. And so I said it was kind of a failure because the project was delayed quite a bit because of all the approvals, the government and the decision makers not understanding that it was innovation, and so it required another way of thinking for approving those projects. Meanwhile, it was such a good solution. It's just a good thing to do. It was low cost, effective, exactly what we needed, and the people operating in that area really benefited from the system, and we were able to give them what they needed. But at the end of the day, we couldn't turn on the system until we got approval. And it happened a year and a half after I left the project. So for a year and a half, the project was kind of sitting in idle. They were refining the interface and still trying to figure out how they could improve it until they could finally turn it on because the management approved it. It was just, anyway, that was just for me a big lesson to say, it's all good in certain systems to promote innovation and try to do things differently. But if the mechanics around it, like all these approval systems, the approval process, whether it's project management, it's funding approval, or even finance was an issue, like the reporting to finance was challenging because of the way we had this financial arrangement with the other department. Anyway, it was just a big mess. So it was interesting. So looking back at it, I think, I was thinking if we were to plan this project again, I think we would need to engage the different stakeholders in the system in a different way to prep them to think outside the box for supporting and approving that project first, because there's no way you can move forward with a project like this anyway. So I don't know if that was useful, but it was a very interesting story for me, learning opportunity for me. Mm-hmm.
Other comments? I've got one more story I can share. I started with a large culture change initiative, and this is kind of the other extreme. This was a large IT implementation shift. And there's multiple chapters to this story. Let me start at the very beginning, because my career actually started as a lead-in to this project. The company at the time in the mid-70s was consolidating operations. It was going through a dramatic reorganization, going from a decentralized to a centralized organization. And it was also doing some major IT technology upgrades with the new generation of the IBM 360 series of computers, dramatic upgrade. And they were, in many cases, still upgrading the accounting systems that were still paper-based. In mid-1975, when I joined the company, all of the investment ledgers were still paper, at that time. And I was hired in with a group of about 50 people to supplement all of IT to do a dramatic upgrade of all the accounting systems, total company-wide. They had just completed the corporate systems, and I was hired in, and I did part of the mining operations, the carbon black chemical operations, and some of the other international operations. So we were all hired in, and there was a multi-year plan to eventually get the entire accounting system over to a new chart of accounts. And it was going really well. This was, in hindsight, very much of an agile approach. We had a lot of short initiatives. The reports themselves were closely developed with the end users. There was a lot of user interaction. I had some great field trips to learn more about the company and the users at that time. But it all kind of came to a screeching halt when the industry went into a marked decline, and the company was facing a near bankruptcy situation, and they started selling off different parts of the organization. And it turned out turns out that because we were dealing with the accounting system by pieces, those pieces oftentimes were easier to sell off. So the core business itself remained in place and really wasn't impacted yet. We're about like 6 months away from having to put the new accounting system in the core part of the operations, when all of a sudden it turns out that that was the only part of the company that remained. So the bulk of the business itself was still in the old accounting system with plans to change the accounting system. The corporate systems were changed, but now we're running separate and we're a minor part of the operation. That's when they decided to do the major change. And that was to go to SAP as an enterprise resource planning system. And they spent millions of dollars putting this together. Now, that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is putting this plan together then. I had worked with systems a lot. At this time, though, I was in an operations area in marketing. But I'd been in and out of IT as always on the peripheral. So the vice president of marketing asked me to serve on this SAP implementation team with the assurance that it was going to be a 1-year project, and he personally would guarantee me a position back in marketing at the end of that year. And I thought about it. And sometimes the best career move that you can make is one that you don't take. And the best career move I ever made was by turning this position down, because I thought about it, in that he was giving me a personal guarantee that he was going to get me another position in marketing. But at the same time, there was no guarantee that he was even going to be in his position in 1 year, because he was rather elderly at that time. Nor was there any guarantee of what type of position that would be in 1 year's time. So I turned it down, and another peer took the job. A year later, he had done his time. He wanted back out into marketing. The vice president came back to me again and offered me the same position, again, the same idea for a year. And I thought about it again and respectively turned it down again. The poor guy that took the job originally ended up retiring in that job 20 years later. He never got back to marketing. He never got his career back on track. But the SAP project continued. And here's where it gets really interesting and where some people make some major mistakes. There was, I think it was Anderson Consulting at the time, was really running the implementation. They had put together this benefit plan that they were going to save 50% of our cost of accounting. 50%. Now, part of that was shifting the workload from data encoders and accountants to managers doing the data encoding themselves. But that means they would have to do the data encoding into a computer versus on hard copy to go to accounting. So that was kind of a trade-off. But they were going to save 50%. So somebody, and I'm not sure exactly who made this call, I don't think they would ever own up to it, but by seeing this 50% cost reduction, they laid off half the accounting people about a month before the system went live. They were just starting to parallel test when they laid off all of these people. And they went live with a bare system intact. They basically scope reduced to the bare minimum. All of the things that people were used to operating with, they no longer had. The number of Excel spreadsheets exploded. The number of reworks went through the roof. And they ended up hiring temporary employees that more than counted for the number of people that they laid off in anticipation of the savings. Now, let me give you a final epilogue, because this is a great case of what happens when a bunch of temporary employees come in to run an accounting system that they really don't know anything about. At that time, invoicing had a color coding sequence before it would go to accounting. You would, if I remember correctly, you would redline the vendor on it so that accounting would then come up with the vendor code and would enter that into the payables system. You would sign it yourself and blue line that so that they would then be able to cross-check your system of authority relative to approving that invoice. And then you would brown line anything that you wanted to go on the invoice into the computer system. Okay. So things were going well. Everybody knew the routine. And then all these temporary employees come in. And one day I'm going through the interoffice mail and I get a check from the company payable to me in the tune of over $35,000. $35,000 payable to me. Okay, what the heck, is that? Somebody made a major mistake. Now, at that time, I was in the marketing department and I was handling all of the accounting cross checks, all the verification of invoices and everything. So I knew enough about the accounting system and where all the hard copy files were made. So I snuck off into the accounting department, went into their file drawers, and I pulled out the invoice that I was able to identify by the coding that was in the computer, that was on the check itself, to find out where it came from. After cross-checking a few things, I got back to the actual invoice, and it turns out that it was a 35,000 plus odd that I had signed as an approval that was payable to an outside research consulting company for research that they had done for our marketing department. And what had happened was that somebody, probably a temporary employee, had mistakenly flip-flopped and had taken my name and put my employee number in as the vendor number, because my employee number was also a valid vendor number for expense reimbursements whenever I traveled. Okay, so my employee number would also be a valid payable number for my expense reimbursement, but they had put that into the system as the outside company that was to be paid. And sure enough, it zip, the accounting system matched the numbers, and I got a check for $35,000. I began to think about it. Okay, here I am with a $35,000 check. I went into the ledger, which great big computer printouts, and sure enough, there it is, payable. But okay, this is out of thousands and thousands of invoices that goes through our department every single month. And I began to think about, okay, now what would happen if that vendor did not get paid? Okay. Well, they probably wouldn't recognize it for another month and then would invoice another time. And I could go ahead and sign that second invoice as if it were the first, and it would go through the system and it would probably hit the accounting books 2 months later. Okay. All of the internal checks and balances would miss it because there's nothing to cross-check the payable, because the vendor would be paid, he'd be satisfied. The only person that would see it would be someone like me that would go through the ledger and would see a particular entry or a spot check. Even the cross-check for duplications, there's a lot of cross-check for duplications of invoices. Those are generally done by vendor number or they're done by dollar amount. In this particular case, they would be able to match the dollar amount, but with the thousands, hundreds of thousands of invoices going through the system every single month, there's no way that it would ever be matched, or a really low probability. So I decided, do I cash it or not? This is tempting because there was a low likelihood I would ever be caught. But I decided I'm going to play this a little bit different. I'll be a loyal employee. So I took it to the chief financial officer and I showed it to him, and he went white because he was seeing exactly what was happening. He knew exactly what happened because it didn't take me hard to explain exactly what had happened because I showed him the invoice that should have been paid versus what was paid. So he knew exactly what was happening. He thanked me profusely, but can you imagine how many other mistakes could have easily been through that system and never caught because there's no checks and balances to catch those. And this was all because of trying to expedite the expected benefits before the system was even implemented. $35,000 I gave back to the company, but it was worth seeing his face.
I mean, it highlights one of the risks in the financial world in Austria. There's a thing called controlling, which is certainly compared with the UK system, it's very, very different. And historically, it's been a career for people in controlling. In fact, a good friend of ours, he was the head controller for the whole of Eastern Europe for one of the big Austrian banks. And so it was a well sought after career. But now with all the algorithms and AI and everything else and systems, those careers are vanishing because it's all being automated. And so you still have inputs at the bottom, and then you have people who are paid to make sense of the information at the top, but all the middle's gone. And so I just wonder today if those checks and balances that you had are any different to those today, which I very much doubt.
I think they're all the same. I mean, everything is automated as best you can. This also brings to mind another audit. You know, I was always involved with different auditing projects. You know, internal auditing would come through routinely to audit things. So I was always involved with them. And in the United States, a number of years back, we had to do Sarbanes-Oxley. It was a law requiring us to cross-check all of our internal control systems. And interesting enough, I actually led the team that did the payables and receivables. Okay. And we had an outside consultant from Anderson Accounting. She was actually on the Enron accounting team when Enron went bankrupt. Okay. But that whole Anderson team then went into Sarbanes-Oxley, and she was leading our team. So basically, I led the internal team on the company side. She led the team on the consultant side. Then we had a half dozen other accountants and auditors working under us. And she was clueless on checks and balances. You know, we were doing payables, and she thought that managers would verify every single item on an employee's expense statement. I said, you know, get real. Now, they're going to look at the bottom line and literally spend 2 to 3 seconds glancing over it and maybe picking one thing out and asking a question, and only look at it in detail if it's a new employee, and then they would verify that the employee knew how to fill out the form. After that was based upon trust. And she says, well, they're signing their name. That is correct. It says they're signing their name to get the paperwork moved. She didn't understand that difference. Okay. And then we were mapping out the payables system and the receivables system. And the whole thing was to basically map out all of the checks and balances in the system. And as I'm looking at this map, it occurs to me that this is a map for fraud. We're identifying all the checkpoints, and all you have to do is find 2 checkpoints that cross-check each other, and you got collusion and you got fraud. So, you know, we weren't doing an internal check on fraud. We were basically doing a roadmap for how to do fraud. It was the craziest thing. But this outside consultant, she was so clueless as to the amount of time that people would do these checks and balances versus built the whole system on trust. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's getting late here. I must go
Okay.
soon because I'm up at the crack of dawn to go over to one of my clients.
Okay, good session. Let me go ahead and lock this down then. Any other closing comments, anyone?
No, thank you. This has been really interesting, and what a career both of you have had in the financial world and now in change management.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
That's
sometimes
very
you learn.
impressive.
Yeah. Sometimes you learn an awful lot about mistakes, and hopefully they're not your mistakes.
Exactly.
For me, it's like management. I always say to my students, you learn more from bad managers than you'll ever learn from good ones.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. And hopefully you'll become, good enough that you won't serve as a learning tool for anyone else.
Absolutely.
Absolutely right.
So,
Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for organizing this. I've
Okay.
enjoyed the sessions I've been able to attend. So
Okay.
thanks for all your effort and all of your hard work. I'm very appreciative. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Well, thank you
thank
for
you
attending
for
today.
finding the time. And there's quite a few good videos out there that the others have produced. And so,
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
I wish you both the best.
Okay.
and you take care.
Have a good day, everybody.
Cheers.
Okay.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.